Welcome back to this Blender for Beginners tutorial series. In our last video, we spent a little bit of time learning UV unwrapping and applying textures to our materials. In this video, we're going to create two more materials at least. We'll see how far we get. One is going to be the glass on these globes. The other will be the painted wooden surface. Let's start with these globes. We're going to create a new material. We're not really going to do much except give a kind of a surfacey kind of look to this. We're not going to change the color or the roughness. It's just going to be the normal, and we're going to do that by creating a simple procedural bump map. So let's click Shift A, and we're going to add a noise texture node, and a bump node, and we'll plug our factor into height, our normal into normal, and let's see what we get. Wow, that looks like crinkled paper almost, or something very crinkly. We're going to change the scale of this noise up to 1000, and let's take the strength of this down to 0.2. 0.2 is generally what I find looks right with predefined maps and such, so I tend to use it with my procedurals as well. And you can see that it makes a very small, bumpy, rough surface on these. But we're not quite done yet. There's one other attribute to change, and that's going to be the transmission. These aren't something you can see straight through, but the light will shine through. So let's make it about half transmission. And if we go into rendered view, you can see what that does for the look of these things. It's not bad. And I think that's all we're going to do for that. So let's go back into material preview view, and you'll notice we didn't do any kind of UV unwrapping or anything. It was just this noise texture, not using any mapping system except its default, which I believe is the object coordinates. Let's select our cabinet and create a new material. This is going to not use a UV map, but we are going to repurpose some of the images that we used earlier. So let's add an image node. And this image node is going to affect our roughness. And we already have the image for the roughness that we want to use, and that's going to be our plastic roughness. So if you hit this button, it will show you images that are already in your blend file, or are already referenced in your blend file. They may not actually be in the blend file. To put things in your blend file, make it part of the same file, you would have to pack your resources. To do that, you would go to File, External Data, and pack all into blend. I'm not doing that right now. It makes a larger file, makes saving take a little longer. It's just not needed. Just don't move those files once they're being referenced by a blend file. Non-color was already selected automatically. That happens sometimes and not others. I couldn't tell you why. Let's add our mapping node and our coordinate system. Now if you have the Node Wrangler add-on enabled, Edit, Preferences, Node Wrangler, you'll have some shortcut keys available. Control T adds both of these nodes because you add them both anyway. So why do more clicks than you need to? Here we can change our coordinate system to object, since we are not unwrapping this. And on our image, rather than projecting it in a flat manner on the surface, we're going to change it to box. That way you can imagine kind of 6 directions around your object from which the texture is being projected on the surface. Right now we can't see it very well, so let's select a color for our cabinet. In fact, I have a hex value that I used in the original file. Now if we look at a more extreme angle with the light, you can see what has happened here. We have not UV unwrapped anything, yet we have a texture that is being projected on here. It is a little too shiny. So in order to adjust our roughness map, we're going to take a color ramp and put it in between the image texture and the principal BSDF. Just drop it on there and it'll connect automatically. We want to change the values of our extreme ends of the spectrum here. So let's bring this up to a value of, say, 0.05. You don't have to be as exact as I'm being here. It's just a matter of what looks good for you. And let's take this down to 0.5 as well, halfway. No, that is definitely not what we want. Maybe it is. It's very shiny. Let's take up that end to there. And maybe our more glossy areas will bring up to a little bit of a more rough look. Let's go into render view and see what that looks like actually. And if we drag that down a little bit again, what do we have? I may have been on the right track in the beginning. I think maybe that looks pretty good. Alright, then let's select our other objects that needs to be on. Control Shift the primary portion, or whichever part you were working with. Control L and bring over the materials. And we have a little rim here. And that is it for our little mini scene here. If we want to give this a render, you'll notice that we're missing a few things for that. In fact, one key thing that we're missing is a camera. When you render a scene, your scene has to have a camera from which to have a point of view into your 3D world. So let's go into front view and put our cursor in the center of the world and hit Shift A. Below everything else, we'll see camera. It is mostly toward the bottom. Click on camera, and if you hit 0 on your numpad, that takes you to the camera view. G will let you move that camera around, but it may not be obvious how to zoom in and out. Hitting G and then tapping your middle mouse button, then drag up and down, and that'll be your zoom. Alternatively, you could move it along the local Z of the camera, and that does the same thing, double tapping Z. So let's move this on the global Z. And move this to a place where we have everything in view. Okay, now we have a lot of empty space. This would look much better as a vertical aspect ratio. So what we can do is, on our output tab right here, we can decide our resolution. Let's just switch these to 1080 by 1920. And so it's still a 1K image. It's just flipped on its end. And it looks like we could move some of this stuff up a little to above those toothbrushes maybe. And now, if we were to hit Z and 8 on the numpad, we get an idea of what our render at this point would look like. Hitting Control B gives you this kind of crosshairs. Draw a box around your camera. And now it's only going to worry about rendering what's in your camera view. Let's go here into a full view, and that looks pretty neat. So if we wanted to make a render that actually looks decent without all this noise, and we wanted to make an output file, how would we go about doing that? Well, we have the render menu here. So you could render your image. If you had multiple frames, animations, you would render animation. There are a few things we need to do before we do run a render process or render our image. And those options are over here in these two tabs. This is your render properties. This is your output properties. In render properties, this is an important number. This is the number of passes that cycles will take per tile when rendering. So the more passes, the less noise will be left at the end. However, it takes a lot longer. So let's keep that at the default for right now. Adaptive sampling helps with this a little bit. Adaptive sampling will take into account places where there's really nothing there, or that it would not take as much effort to resolve the noise. And so it'll use less passes at those locations. So you'll get a little bit of a quicker render depending on what's in your scene. In this case, it'll actually save us some time because there's a lot of blank space here. So those blank areas, it doesn't need to do a whole lot of calculation to render. So adaptive sampling will help us here. Denoising, I would say leave these settings alone. There are better ways to denoise your image. So why would you denoise? You would just up your samples, right? You would just have a whole lot more samples and then you'd get rid of your noise. Well, like I said, that takes a whole lot more time. The more samples that are required, the more time is required. So oftentimes you will render something to a point where it looks pretty good, and then you'll apply some denoising to get rid of kind of what's left. So with our simple render, we are done with this tab. Let's go over here to output, and we've already configured our resolution of our output file, and we're just going to render one frame. So we're not doing any kind of animation here. So this we'll leave alone as well. This is a path that you would set for an animation to render to. This is your output file format. PNG is usually pretty good, especially if you want to have a transparent background. You have the ability to choose an RGBA color space, A meaning alpha, so it's RGB and an alpha channel. If you wanted a transparent background and you didn't have this selected, you would get a background that is black. RGB or black and white are your two other options. So with that, let's click on render and render image. And you'll see these tiles form. If you are using CPU compute rather than GPU, you'll probably see more tiles and they'll be smaller. Now a CPU will generally operate better with smaller tile sizes. Usually that's 32 by 32 as opposed to something like 512 by 512 for a GPU. That is not something you really have to set anymore. It would be under performance. However, there is an add-on that's called auto tile size that you'll see I have enabled. It chooses the best tile size for your render based on the hardware that you're using. So if I were to go up here to CPU compute and hit F12, which is the shortcut for render, you'll see each core of my CPU is rendering, and they are much smaller, and that is because auto tile size has determined that that is the tile size that works best for my CPU. And you'll notice that took a whole lot longer than the GPU render. This is even more noticeable when you have a complex scene. So I hit F12 and you'll see I have large tiles with my GPU selected, and it takes much, much less time to get a final result. Now you'll see this still has some noise all over it. So, like I said, the first way to get rid of noise is to have more samples. Let's go up to 512. Hit F12. And you'll see it is taking longer, but our adaptive sampling means that it is zipping right past those black areas. And we're getting less noise than we did before. One place that you will get noise in this image is going to be on those glass globes at the top. Anything transparent generates a lot of noise. So if you don't need something transparent in your scene, don't put it there. Another trick to reducing noise and render time when glass is involved is to turn off caustics. Caustics are things like refraction, or when light passes through colored glass, the shadow is not just gray, it is the color of that glass because you have light shining through it. That sort of thing is called caustics, and we can turn that on and off when needed. To turn off caustics, we go to light paths. And there are two types of caustics. One is refractive and one is reflective. We're going to turn off both and see if that makes a difference in our scene. Now, the thing that we want to see, that those glass globes at the top, are only going to be rendered toward the end of this process, and that's the part we want to see, which is kind of frustrating. So how do you make adjustments to certain things and see the difference without rendering an entire scene over and over? You can see that that's actually a little better already, as is our glass ball down here. So we already did this before. Control B, and you can select something in your scene. When you render again, my key just came off my keyboard. You'll see that it renders only the part that is in that black space. I'm sorry, that red and white rectangle. And if you don't see it at first, you can hit home to zoom extents, or you can zoom out. If this is taking a long time for your computer to render these, what you can do is just reduce your resolution, and it will take a lot less time. 70% of this should be about a 720 resolution, and you'll notice when that finishes, it's already a much smaller image. So that is the basic starting point of rendering. And materials. Materials are needed for rendering, lighting is needed for rendering, and so is a camera. Our lighting is provided by our HDRI. Our camera is right in front of us here. And our materials, we just walked through making a few of them. Now in the next video, we're going to go about making the room that this will sit in, putting our window in the wall, and adding a few items that we are not going to create ourselves. We'll be appending objects that other artists have already made and have made available to other artists under a Creative Commons license. So with that, save your file, and I will see you in the next video. Hey guys, if you found this video useful, hit like and consider subscribing to the channel. and you can turn on that notification bell too so that you don't miss future videos. Until next time, I'm Carl with Blender Forge.